I always thought family was about unconditional love and support. Growing up in a tight-knit household in small-town Wisconsin, that's all I ever knew. So when I fell in love with Mason Wilson, the quiet architect with kind eyes who moved to our neighborhood from Seattle, I never imagined his family would reject me without even meeting me. But they did. They refused to attend our wedding, claiming I wasn't good enough for their son, not educated enough, not wealthy enough, not from the right background. Mason stood by me anyway, choosing love over his family's approval. We got married in a small ceremony with just my family and our closest friends. It was beautiful, despite the empty chairs where his parents should have been. 3 months after our wedding, everything changed. A certified letter arrived addressed to Mason. His estranged uncle, a man he'd only met twice, had passed away. Mason was his sole heir. The inheritance was substantial, life-changing, actually. When his parents found out, they suddenly wanted to be part of our lives again. But money changes everything. Sometimes it reveals who people truly are, and sometimes it gives you the power to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I met Mason Wilson on a rainy Tuesday at Harborview Coffee, the small cafe where I worked while finishing my associate's degree in business administration at the local community college. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, sketching buildings in a worn leather notebook. I noticed him right away. Not just because he was handsome with his dark, wavy hair and glasses, but because of how focused he was, completely lost in his work while the rain streaked down the windows beside him. After his third visit that week, I worked up the courage to ask about his drawings. "They're just rough concepts," he said, unexpectedly sliding the notebook toward me. "I'm an architect, just moved here from Seattle to work on the new public library downtown." His name was Mason Wilson, 28, originally from Greenwich, Connecticut. He'd graduated from Cornell with honors before working at a prestigious firm in Seattle. Now he was here in our mid-sized Wisconsin town for at least a year, overseeing his first major project as lead architect. I was Ellie Parker, 25, born and raised just outside of town, community college student, full-time barista, with dreams of opening my own small business someday. Our worlds couldn't have been more different, but something clicked between us immediately. Our first date was the following weekend, a walk through the local sculpture garden followed by dinner at my favorite hole-in-the-wall Mexican restaurant. Mason was different from anyone I'd ever dated. He was brilliant but humble, ambitious but kind. He listened like I was the most interesting person he'd ever met, asking thoughtful questions about my business ideas, my family, my dreams. "My parents wanted me to follow in my father's footsteps and become a surgeon," he confessed over chips and salsa. When I chose architecture instead, there was a huge fight. We barely spoke during my first 2 years of college. "That's awful," I said. "My parents have always been supportive, even when they don't fully understand my choices." Mason smiled sadly. "The Wilsons have certain expectations. My father's a neurosurgeon. My mother's on the board of 3 major charities. My sister went to medical school like she was supposed to. I was always the difficult one." Over the next 6 months, we fell deeply in love. Mason became a regular at Sunday dinners with my family. My parents adored him, and my younger brothers thought his architectural knowledge was the coolest thing ever. My grandmother kept asking when he was going to make an honest woman out of me, embarrassing me to no end. But I never met Mason's family. They called weekly, and I could always feel the tension in Mason's shoulders when he spoke with them. He'd pace around our apartment. We'd moved in together after 4 months, giving short answers and frequently saying, "That's not really your concern." I tried not to take it personally at first. "Have you told them about me?" I asked one night, after a particularly tense call. Mason sighed, running his hands through his hair. Yes, they know we're living together. And? He hesitated. They think I'm making a mistake. They think I should be with someone different. Different how? I pressed, though I already knew the answer. Someone from a similar background. Someone with an Ivy League education and family connections. Mason took my hands. They're snobs, Ellie. Terrible, judgmental snobs who think your worth as a human being is determined by your pedigree and bank account. I swallowed hard. Do they even want to meet me? Not really, he admitted. But I don't care. I love you. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. When Mason proposed 6 months later on the rooftop of the nearly completed library he'd designed, I was ecstatic. We planned a small wedding for the following spring. Nothing fancy, just close friends and family at my parents' backyard. That's when the real trouble started. Mason called his parents to tell them the news, putting the call on speaker so I could be part of the conversation. His mother's voice was cold and clipped. Mason, this is getting ridiculous. You cannot marry this waitress. I flinched, but Mason's jaw tightened. She's not just a waitress, Mother. Ellie's brilliant and kind and hardworking. She's getting her degree and has amazing plans for her future. A community college degree, his father interjected dismissively. Do you have any idea what that will look like? What will people say? I don't care what people say, Mason replied. Well, you should, his mother snapped. The Wilsons have a certain standing. We have traditions, expectations. Your sister married a cardiac surgeon. Your cousins all married within appropriate circles. We will not attend this wedding, his father declared. And if you go through with it, you can expect to be removed from the will. We will not fund this. Mistake. Mason ended the call and pulled me close as tears rolled down my cheeks. I'm so sorry, Ellie. They don't matter. We don't need them or their money. But they're your family, I whispered. You're my family now, he said firmly. The family I choose. The months leading up to our wedding were strained. Mason's parents made several attempts to break us up. They offered to pay for him to take a prestigious position in London, if he ended things with me. When that didn't work, they showed up unannounced at our apartment while Mason was at work. Margaret and Richard Wilson looked exactly as I'd imagined, expensively dressed, perfectly groomed, and wearing identical expressions of disdain as they examined our modest apartment. Ms. Parker, Margaret said, not offering her hand. We'd like to speak with you privately. I gestured to the couch, my heart pounding. Would you like some coffee? No, Richard said. This won't take long. They sat rigidly on the edge of our second-hand sofa. Margaret opened her designer handbag and withdrew a checkbook. We're prepared to offer you $50,000 to end this relationship, she said, as casually as if ordering lunch. Mason has a bright future ahead of him. You're holding him back. I stared at them in shock. You can't be serious. We're extremely serious, Richard said. Mason comes from a certain world, one you can never be part of. Eventually, he'll resent you for diminishing his opportunities. I love your son, I said, my voice shaking, and he loves me. No amount of money will change that. Margaret's smile was cold. Everyone has a price, dear. What's yours? 100,000? I stood up. I think you should leave. You're making a mistake, Richard warned. If you truly cared about Mason, you'd want what's best for him. I am what's best for him, I replied, finding my courage, because I love him for who he is, not for his family name or connections or potential earning power. Now please, get out of our home. When Mason came home that evening, I told him everything. He was furious, immediately calling his parents to tell them they were no longer welcome in our lives. Don't come to the wedding, he said flatly. We don't want you there. The day before our wedding, Mason's younger sister Audrey called. She'd always been closer to their parents, following their expectations to the letter. Mason, please reconsider, she begged. They're beside themselves. Just postpone the wedding. Take some time to think. I've done all the thinking I need to do, Mason replied. I love Ellie. I'm marrying her tomorrow. You're welcome to come if you'd like to support us. There was a pause. You know I can't. Go against them, she said finally. I'm sorry. Our wedding day dawned bright and beautiful. My family worked tirelessly to make everything perfect. My mother and grandmother prepared all the food. My father and brothers set up tables and chairs in the backyard, and my best friends decorated with wildflowers and twinkling lights. I wore a simple white dress I'd found on sale, carrying a bouquet of daisies and lavender. Mason looked handsome in his navy suit, his eyes lighting up when he saw me walking toward him on my father's arm. The empty chairs on the groom's side were noticeable, but we were surrounded by people who truly cared about us. My father gave a moving toast, welcoming Mason to our family and promising that he'd gained not just a wife, but parents who would love him as their own son. We danced under the stars, ate homemade cake, and promised to build a life filled with love rather than material things. As we drove away from the reception, tin cans rattling behind our used Honda, Mason kissed me and whispered, "Best day of my life." We couldn't afford a fancy honeymoon, so we spent a week in a small cabin by Lake Michigan, hiking during the day and lying in each other's arms at night, planning our future. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. We decided to stay in Wisconsin, at least until Mason finished the IE library project. I would complete my associate's degree that fall, then start working on my business plan for a specialty bakery featuring my grandmother's recipes. We'll have to save for a while, I said one night, curled against Mason's chest. Startup costs for even a small bakery are pretty significant. We'll make it happen, Mason promised. I believe in you, Ellie. We'll figure it out together. We returned to real life. Mason to his architectural firm, me to my classes and shifts at the coffee shop. We were happy in our little apartment with our secondhand furniture and big dreams. Sometimes I caught Mason looking wistful when he spoke to colleagues who were still close with their families, but he always insisted he had no regrets. 3 months after our wedding, everything changed. It started with a certified letter addressed to Mason. He opened it one evening after work, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he read. "Ellie," he said, his voice strange. "You remember me mentioning my Uncle Jack, my father's older brother?" I nodded. Mason had told me about his eccentric uncle who'd rejected the family business to become a wildlife photographer, traveling the world and rarely coming home. He'd been estranged from Mason's father for decades. He died last month. Apparently, he had pancreatic cancer. Mason's hands were shaking. I only met him twice, but he's left me everything. His entire estate. What does that mean? I asked, moving to sit beside him. Mason handed me the letter. Uncle Jack Wilson had amassed a surprising fortune through savvy investments and his award-winning photography. He'd never married or had children of his own. The letter from the estate attorney indicated that Mason was the sole beneficiary of an estate valued at approximately $4.2 million. $4 million? I whispered, the number seeming impossible. Mason looked as stunned as I felt. The attorney wants to meet next week to go over the details. There's a house in Montana, some investment accounts, and apparently a substantial amount in liquid assets. We sat in silence, the magnitude of the change washing over us. We'd been planning our lives around careful budgeting and gradual progress toward our dreams. Suddenly, everything could be different. You could open your bakery right away, Mason said finally, a smile spreading across his face. No loans, no waiting. We could buy a house, travel, help your parents repair their roof. My mind was spinning with possibilities. It doesn't feel real. There's something else, Mason said, his expression growing serious. We need to decide what to do about my parents. I understood immediately. The news would undoubtedly reach them soon, and they would react. The inheritance was substantial, far more than whatever they'd threatened to withhold from Mason when they'd demanded he not marry me. The following morning, Mason's phone rang. It was his mother. "Mason, darling." Her voice was warm, so different from the coldness of our previous interactions. "We've just heard about poor Jack. What a shock. We're so sorry." Mason put the call on speaker, raising an eyebrow at me. "Are you? You and Dad hardly spoke to him for 30 years. Water under the bridge," she said dismissively. "Family is family. We should all come together in times like these. Your father and I would love to have you for dinner this weekend. We could fly out Friday." Mason's jaw tightened. "Just me? Or does your dinner invitation include my wife?" There was a brief pause. "Of course Ellie is included," she said, though I could hear the strain in her voice. "We'd love to finally meet her properly." After the call ended, Mason and I looked at each other. "Unbelievable," he muttered. 3 months of silence, and suddenly they want a family reunion. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Mason thought for a moment. "I want to see them," he said finally. "But not for the reasons they think. They showed us who they really are, Ellie. They chose money and status over their own son's happiness. I'm not going to just pretend that didn't happen." "What are you planning?" I asked, seeing the determined look in his eyes. "A lesson," he said simply. "One they badly need." The following Friday, we flew to Connecticut. Mason's parents sent a car to pick us up from the airport, a sleek black town car with a uniformed driver who took our modest luggage with a polite nod. The Wilson family home was exactly as intimidating as I'd imagined. A sprawling colonial on manicured grounds in one of Greenwich's most exclusive neighborhoods. As we approached the front door, I squeezed Mason's hand. "Remember," he whispered, "you belong here just as much as they do. More, actually. You're a good person, Ellie. They're just rich." The door opened before we could ring the bell. Margaret. Wilson stood there, impeccably dressed in a cashmere sweater and pearls, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Mason, darling," she said, embracing him stiffly. "And Ellie. How lovely to finally meet you properly." Richard appeared behind her, extending his hand to Mason. "Son, good to see you." We were ushered into a formal living room that looked like it belonged in a magazine, all antiques and artwork that probably cost more than my parents' entire house. Mason's sister Audrey was already there with her husband, Dr. Bradley Thompson. They both offered cool smiles but little warmth. "Drink?" Richard offered, gesturing to a crystal decanter. "No, thank you," Mason said. "I'd like to keep a clear head for this conversation." An uncomfortable silence fell. Margaret attempted to fill it with superficial questions about our flight and comments about the unseasonably warm weather. Finally, when we were seated at the dining table being served an elaborate meal by uniformed staff, Richard cleared his throat. "We've been thinking, Mason, about the future, about family." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" "Yes," Margaret interjected smoothly. "We may have been hasty in our judgment. Everyone makes mistakes." "Mistakes," Mason repeated. "You mean, like trying to bribe my wife to leave me? Or threatening to disown me for marrying someone I love? Those kinds of mistakes?" Audrey gasped softly, and Bradley suddenly became very interested in his wine glass. "We were concerned," Richard said stiffly. "We wanted to protect you." "From what?" Mason asked. "From being happy? From being with someone genuine who loves me for who I am, not what I can provide or how I look on paper?" Margaret's smile was strained. "Perhaps we could start fresh. Put the past behind us. After all, circumstances change." "Ah." Mason nodded slowly. "There it is. Circumstances change. You mean Uncle Jack's money changes everything, don't you? That's not fair, Audrey protested weakly. Isn't it? Mason countered. Where were all of you 3 months ago? At my wedding? Calling to congratulate us? Supporting my choice of partner? Richard set down his fork. We've extended an olive branch here, Mason. The mature thing would be to accept it. The mature thing, Mason said calmly, would have been to support your son's happiness from the beginning. The mature thing would have been to meet Ellie before judging her. The mature thing would have been to value love over money and status. He reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it. But you've made one critical error in your calculations, Mason continued. You assume that because I've inherited Uncle Jack's estate, I'm suddenly acceptable again. That Ellie is somehow worthy of your acknowledgement now. Margaret's smile faltered. That's not... It's exactly what this is, Mason interrupted. And here's what you don't understand. Uncle Jack left me his money because the one time I met him as an adult, at grandmother's funeral 5 years ago, we talked about my dreams of becoming an architect, about building things that would last, that would mean something. He liked that. I had chosen my own path instead of following the one laid out for me. He valued individuality and authenticity, everything this family lacks. Mason pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. I've made some decisions about the inheritance. Richard reached for the envelope, but Mason held up a hand. I'd like to finish. He looked around the table, meeting each family member's eyes in turn. This dinner invitation wasn't about reconciliation. It was about money. You thought if you pretended to accept Ellie, you'd have access to Uncle Jack's fortune. But here's the thing about wealth. It reveals character. And you've revealed yours. Mason slid the envelope toward his father. Inside is a cashier's check for $1 million made out to the community college where Ellie studies. They're establishing a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. We're calling it the Parker Wilson Opportunity Fund, in honor of Ellie's parents, who taught her the values of hard work, integrity, and unconditional love, values this family could learn from. Margaret's face had gone pale, while Richard stared at the envelope as if it might bite him. The rest of the inheritance, Mason continued, will be carefully managed. We're buying a modest home in Wisconsin. Ellie's opening her bakery. We're setting up college funds for the children we hope to have someday. And we're establishing a foundation to support arts education in underserved communities, because everyone deserves the chance to pursue their passions, regardless of their pedigree. He stood, and I followed his lead. Thank you for dinner. We won't be staying the night. Our car is waiting to take us to a hotel. Mason, be reasonable, Richard started. I am being extremely reasonable, Mason replied. I'm not cutting you out of my life the way you tried to cut me out of yours. You're welcome to visit us in Wisconsin anytime. You can meet Ellie's wonderful family. You can see the life we're building together, but it will be on our terms, defined by mutual respect. As we walked toward the door, Mason paused. One last thing. Uncle Jack left a letter with his will. He said he'd watched from afar as this family became obsessed with status and appearances. He hoped his money might help break that cycle. I intend to honor that wish. The drive back to our hotel was quiet, both of us processing the evening. Finally, I asked, "Are you okay?" Mason smiled, looking lighter than I'd seen him in months. I'm better than okay. For the first time, I feel truly free. Free to define success on our terms. Free to build the life and family we want. He took my hand. I made the right choice, Ellie. I chose love. I chose you. And I'd do it again, inheritance or no inheritance. As our car moved through the night, I rested my head on his shoulder, thinking about the future we would build together. One founded on the right values, the ones that truly mattered. Maybe someday his family would understand that. Maybe they wouldn't. But either way, we had each other, And that was the greatest inheritance of all. The return flight to Wisconsin the next morning felt like leaving a foreign country. The opulence of Greenwich, with its manicured lawns and luxury cars, seemed worlds away from the modest Midwest town we called home. Mason was quiet during most of the flight, occasionally squeezing my hand or giving me a reassuring smile. "No? Regrets?" I asked as we began our descent. "Not a single one," he replied, though I am wondering if my mother's face will stay permanently frozen in that shocked expression. We laughed together, the tension of the previous night finally breaking. The confrontation with his family had been difficult, but necessary. Now we could move forward on our own terms. My parents were waiting at the small regional airport, eager to hear about our trip. We'd called them briefly before boarding to explain we were coming home early, but had saved the details for in person. Mom had prepared a late lunch, and we gathered around their kitchen table, the same one where we'd planned our wedding and where I'd done my homework growing up. When we finished recounting the dinner with Mason's parents, there was a moment of stunned silence. $4 million, my dad finally said, shaking his head in disbelief. That's life-changing money." "It is," Mason agreed. "But we're determined not to let it change who we are or what matters to us." Mom reached across the table and took both our hands in hers. "I'm so proud of how you handled this, both of you. That scholarship fund is going to help so many people." "We thought you might help us look at properties," I said. "Nothing extravagant, but maybe something with a little more space and a better kitchen for me to test recipes." Dad's eyes lit up at the prospect of house hunting. He'd worked in construction his whole life before retiring last year and loved evaluating properties. "I'd be honored, and I can help you spot any structural issues." We spent the rest of the afternoon discussing possibilities for the house, for my bakery, for our future. These were the conversations family was supposed to have. Supportive, excited, focused on building something together. The following week, we met with Uncle Jack's attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Barbara Lowenstein who had managed his affairs for decades. She handed Mason a sealed envelope along with the official paperwork. "Jack asked me to give you this personally," she explained. "He revised his will 6 months ago, after his diagnosis. He was very specific about his wishes." Later, in the privacy of our apartment, Mason opened the letter with trembling hands. "Dear Mason," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, then I've finally run out of adventures. Don't waste time feeling sad. I've had a good run, better than most. You might be wondering why I left everything to you, a nephew I barely knew. The truth is, I've been keeping tabs on you from a distance. Your grandmother used to send me Christmas cards with family updates until she passed. Then I started following your career online. I was at your graduate showcase at Cornell, though you didn't see me. I recognized something in you that reminds me of myself, the courage to choose your own path despite pressure to conform. When I heard through family connections that you'd fallen in love with someone your parents deemed unsuitable, I knew you were indeed my nephew in spirit as well as blood. I made my fortune by seeing value where others didn't, in untouched landscapes, in forgotten places, in overlooked investments. The world is full of hidden treasures if you know how to look. It seems you found yours in Ellie. Use this money to build a life of meaning, not appearances. Create something lasting. And remember that the best inheritance isn't what's in your bank account. It's who you choose to become. Wishing you clear skies and open roads, Uncle Jack." Mason folded the letter carefully, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "He saw me," he said simply, even when my own parents didn't. The next months passed in a whirlwind of activity. We found a charming craftsman-style house on the edge of town. Not ostentatious, but spacious and well-built, with a beautiful maple tree in the backyard and enough room for future children. My dad inspected every inch of it and declared it solid as they come, his highest form of praise. We collaborated with the community college to establish the scholarship fund, working with administrators to create criteria that would truly help students who needed it most. The first recipients would be selected for the upcoming fall semester. My bakery plans accelerated from distant dreams to imminent reality. I found a vacant storefront downtown, just a block from the new library Mason had designed. The symbolism wasn't lost on us, our professional dreams taking physical form side by side. I hired a contractor to renovate the space, incorporating elements of Mason's architectural aesthetics with my vision of a warm, welcoming neighborhood bakery. Through it all, we tried to maintain perspective. We bought sensible, reliable vehicles instead of luxury cars. We furnished our home with quality pieces that would last, rather than showy status symbols. We set up substantial retirement accounts and investment portfolios with the help of a fiduciary financial advisor Barbara recommended, someone who wouldn't push us toward unnecessary risks or extravagances. We have the rare opportunity to do this right, Mason said one evening as we walked through our new neighborhood. To use this money thoughtfully, not impulsively. I keep pinching myself, I admitted. A year ago, I was worrying about tuition payments and whether we could afford a weekend trip to Chicago. And now? Now I'm designing my dream bakery and interviewing potential employees. I leaned into his side, but the best things haven't changed. You, us, this. Mason planted a kiss on the top of my head. That's exactly right. 3 weeks before my bakery's grand opening, we received an unexpected phone call from Audrey, Mason's sister. Mason? It's me, she said hesitantly when he answered. I was wondering if we could talk. Mason put the call on speaker so I could hear. We're listening? Not over the phone, she said. In person. I'd like to come visit, if that's okay. Just me, not Bradley, not Mom and Dad. After a moment's silent communication with me, raised eyebrows and a slight nod, Mason agreed. You're welcome to visit. When were you thinking? Would this weekend be too soon? That Saturday, we picked Audrey up from the airport. She looked different from the polished, reserved woman we'd seen at her parents' house, more casual in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail instead of the elegant updo she'd worn before. Thank you for having me, she said as we drove home, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. I know this is unexpected. What brings you to Wisconsin? Mason asked, not unkindly but with clear boundaries in his tone. Audrey gazed out the window, at the passing scenery. I needed to see you, to talk to you. Things haven't been the same since that dinner. At home, I made coffee while Mason showed his sister around. When they reached my soon-to-open bakery's website, displayed on the computer in Mason's home office, I heard Audrey's exclamation of surprise. You designed this yourself? It's beautiful, Ellie. Thank you, I said, bringing in a tray with coffee and some test batches of almond croissants I'd been perfecting. I've been taking some design classes to complement my business degree. We settled in the living room, an awkward triangle of family connections and unspoken tensions. Finally, Audrey set down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. I owe you both an apology, she said. Especially you, Ellie. I should have stood up to our parents. I should have come to your wedding. Mason's expression remained neutral. What changed your mind? Watching you stand your ground at dinner, seeing how happy you are together. She hesitated. And some things that happened afterward. She took a deep breath. After you left, Dad exploded. He called you ungrateful, entitled. Said you'd regret turning your back on the family. Mom started making plans to contest Uncle Jack's will, claiming he wasn't of sound mind. They can't do that, Mason said sharply. Barbara has extensive documentation of Jack's competency when he made his decisions. I know. I told them that. I also told them they were making a terrible mistake. Audrey's voice wavered. For the first time in my life, I disagreed with them openly. It didn't go well. She explained that their parents had expected her to side, with them unquestioningly, as she always had. When she didn't, the facade of family unity cracked. Long-suppressed resentment surfaced, her parents' controlling behavior, their conditional love based on achievement and compliance, their obsession with appearances over substance. They actually suggested that Bradley and I should try to ingratiate ourselves with you to access Uncle Jack's money, she said, looking embarrassed. That was my breaking point. I told them I was done being their puppet. That must have been difficult, I said softly. Despite everything, I felt a surge of compassion for this woman who had lived her entire life under the weight of her parents' expectations. It was terrifying, Audrey admitted. I've never defied them before. But watching you two, how you support each other, how you make decisions based on your values rather than what other people think, it made me realize how empty my life has been. She turned to Mason. Remember how close we were as kids? Before they started grooming me for medical school and pushing you toward surgery? Mason's expression softened slightly. I remember building forts in the woods behind grandmother's house, and that summer we spent catching fireflies in mason jars. Exactly. Somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I became what they wanted instead of figuring out who I actually am. She looked down at her hands. Bradley and I are separating. It turns out neither of us is particularly happy. We just got married because it looked good on paper. I'm sorry to hear that, Mason said. And I could tell he meant it. Don't be. It's overdue. He's actually relieved. Apparently, he always wanted to specialize in tropical medicine and work with Doctors Without Borders, but his parents and our parents pushed him toward cardiology for prestige and income. She gave a sad laugh. We've both been living lies. Over dinner, Audrey continued to open up. She was considering a career change, possibly into public health education. She'd always loved teaching but had been steered away from it as beneath her potential. I don't expect us to magically become close again, she told Mason as the evening wound down. I know I have to earn your trust back. I just wanted you to know that I see things clearly now, and I'm trying to change. That means a lot, Mason said. And for what it's worth, I think the real Audrey, the one who's finding her own path, is someone worth knowing. Audrey stayed the entire weekend, helping me with final preparations for the bakery and genuinely connecting with both of us. She came to Sunday dinner at my parents' house, where my family welcomed her warmly despite knowing our history. My younger brothers immediately drew her into their ongoing debate about the best local fishing spots, while my mother showed her family photo albums, including pictures from our wedding. You look so happy, Audrey said, studying a photo of Mason and me during our first dance. I should have been there. You're here now, I replied. That's what matters. When we dropped her at the airport on Sunday evening, she hugged us both tightly. Thank you for giving me a second chance, she whispered. I promise not to waste it. 2 weeks later, Parker and Wilson Bakery opened its doors. The name had been Mason's Suggestion, a blending of our families, our histories, our futures. The grand opening exceeded all expectations, with lines stretching down the block. My specialty items, particularly grandmother's cinnamon rolls and my signature lavender honey scones, sold out within hours. Local media covered the opening, praising the warm atmosphere and declaring it a welcome addition to the revitalized downtown area. The reporter mentioned that the bakery was located near the acclaimed new public library, not realizing both projects were connected to our family. Your husband designed that beautiful building? She asked when I mentioned it casually. He did, I confirmed. We're kind of a creative partnership. The story that ran the following day emphasized the local couple behind both projects, highlighting our commitment to the community. Somehow, the fact that we'd recently established a major scholarship fund at the community college was included, though we hadn't mentioned it. The article went viral in our small city, shared hundreds of times on social media. People began coming, to the bakery specifically to meet us, sharing stories of their own educational struggles or dreams of entrepreneurship. One elderly woman pressed my hand and tearfully explained that her granddaughter had just been named one of the first recipients of our scholarship. "She's the first in our family to go to college," she told me. "This changes everything for her." I was still processing this encounter when I looked up to see Margaret and Richard Wilson standing awkwardly at the bakery entrance. They looked oddly diminished without the backdrop of their Greenwich mansion, still expensively dressed, but somehow less intimidating. Margaret clutched her designer handbag like a shield, while Richard scanned the bustling bakery with an unreadable expression. Mason spotted them a moment after I did, his body tensing beside me. "What are you doing here?" he asked, not bothering. "With greetings. We read the article," Margaret said, "about the bakery and the scholarship." She glanced around, taking in the warm wood accents, the display cases filled with artisan pastries, the comfortable seating areas where customers chatted over coffee and treats. "It's lovely," she admitted, sounding surprised. "Very inviting." "That was the goal," I said, finding my voice. "We wanted it to feel like home." Richard cleared his throat. "Could we speak somewhere private?" Mason hesitated, then nodded toward the small office in the back. 10 minutes, he said firmly. Once the door closed behind us, an uncomfortable silence fell. Finally, Richard spoke. "Audrey came to see us after visiting you," he said. "She had quite a lot to say." "I'm sure she did," Mason replied neutrally. "She's making some questionable choices," Margaret interjected. "Talking about divorce, career changes. She mentioned you two had influenced her." "We didn't influence anyone," I said. "We just showed her it's possible to live authentically, even when it's difficult." Richard's jaw tightened, but then surprisingly, he nodded. "Perhaps that's not entirely unwelcome. Audrey seems more herself than she has in years." "We've been doing some reflecting," Margaret added, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her silk blouse. "About family, about choices." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Mason asked, his tone still guarded. Richard hesitated. "That we may have been inflexible in our thinking." "Inflexible," Mason repeated. "That's one word for it." "We're trying, Mason," Margaret said, a rare note of genuine emotion in her voice. "This isn't easy for us. We've lived a certain way our entire lives. And that justifies how you treated us? The check you offered Ellie to leave me? Missing our wedding?" "No," Richard said quietly. "It doesn't." The simple admission seemed to cost him physical effort, his shoulders slightly slumping. "We read about the scholarship fund," Margaret said. "About your plans for arts education. About this place." She gestured to the bakery beyond the office walls. "You've built something meaningful here. Something legitimate." I felt Mason stiffen beside me at the word legitimate, but I touched his arm gently. I could see what this visit had cost his parents, their rigid pride cracking, however slightly. "Why? Are you really here?" Mason asked directly. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances. "To see if there might be a way forward," Richard finally said. "Some path to reconciliation." "On what terms?" Mason pressed. "We don't know yet," Margaret admitted. "This is new territory for us." Mason was quiet for a long moment, studying. His parents as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Not as the towering authorities of his childhood, but as flawed, aging people struggling to adapt to changing realities. "I can't promise anything," he said eventually, "but I'm willing to take small steps. Very small steps." Relief flashed across Margaret's face before she composed herself. "That's all we're asking. A chance." We emerged from the office to find the bakery still bustling with afternoon customers. One of my new employees, a community college student named Zoe, was efficiently managing the register while her classmate Tyler arranged fresh pastries in the display case. "Your staff is very professional," Richard commented, watching them work. "They're both scholarship recipients," I explained. "Part of their award includes practical business experience here at the bakery." Something shifted in Richard's expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps a new understanding. "We should let you get back to your customers," Margaret said. "We're staying at the hotel downtown for 2 days, if you'd like to have dinner tomorrow." Mason looked at me, silently asking my opinion. I gave a small nod. "Dinner might work," he said. "I'll text you tomorrow." After they left, Mason exhaled heavily. "Well, that was unexpected." "Do you think they're sincere?" I asked, leaning against him behind the counter. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But Audrey's change seems genuine. Maybe they're capable of growth, too." I thought about the scholarship recipient's grandmother, her tears of gratitude, about Audrey finding her authentic self after years of conformity, about the ripple effects of choices made with integrity rather than fear. "People can surprise you," I said, watching through the window as Mason's parents walked slowly down the street, their designer clothing at odds with the casual Midwest town around them. "For better or worse," Mason smiled, pressing a kiss to my temple. "You surprised me. Best surprise of my life." Around us, the bakery hummed with conversation and laughter, the aroma of fresh pastries filling the air. The new library stood proudly down the street, its modern lines a testament to Mason's vision. And somewhere across town, students were planning futures made possible by the scholarship bearing our names. None of this would have existed if we'd made different choices, if we'd valued approval over authenticity, security over love, or status over substance. The inheritance had accelerated our dreams, but it hadn't created them. Those had been ours all along. "Ready for the afternoon rush?" I asked, retying my apron. "Ready for everything," Mason replied, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the bakery. Whatever came next, with his family, with our future, we would face it together, on our own terms. That was the true inheritance we'd claimed, the courage to build a life of meaning, regardless of who understood its value. The dinner. With Mason's parents, the following evening was strained but civil. We met at a local restaurant known for its farm-to-table cuisine. Not the fanciest place in town, but certainly the one with the most integrity in its sourcing and preparation. It seemed fitting somehow. Richard and Margaret arrived precisely on time, both still looking somewhat out of place in our Midwestern setting, despite having changed into slightly more casual attire. Margaret had traded her designer dress for tailored slacks and a cashmere sweater, while Richard wore dark jeans that probably cost more than my first car. "This is charming," Margaret said, as we were seated, her eyes taking in the exposed brick walls and locally made pottery that decorated the shelves. "The chef trained in Chicago but moved back to his hometown to start this place," I explained. "He uses ingredients from within a 100-mile radius whenever possible." Richard studied the menu with the careful attention of someone used to dining at Michelin-starred establishments. "No wine list?" "They partner with a local vineyard," Mason said. "Just ask the server for recommendations. Their Riesling is excellent." The conversation circled cautiously around neutral topics at first. The unseasonably warm spring weather, the architectural details of the historic downtown buildings, the library Mason had designed. I could feel my shoulders gradually relaxing as we made it through appetizers without any thinly veiled insults or uncomfortable questions about our kind of people. It wasn't until our entrees arrived that Richard finally broached more sensitive territory. "We visited your community college this morning," he said, cutting precisely into his locally raised steak. "Met with the dean of students." Mason set down his fork. "You did?" Margaret nodded. "We wanted to understand more about the scholarship program you've established." "And?" I prompted when neither of them continued. "It's quite comprehensive," Richard admitted. The dean was very enthusiastic about its potential impact. We spoke with a few students who've received awards, Margaret added, including a young woman who works at your bakery. Zoe, I confirmed. She's studying business administration and hospitality management. She was very articulate about her goals, Margaret said, sounding almost surprised. She mentioned that you're mentoring. Her, I am. She reminds me of myself a few years ago. Lots of ambition, but limited resources or connections. I took a sip of water. Sometimes opportunity is all people need to excel. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I suppose I never considered it that way. The rest of the meal progressed with a new, tentative openness. They asked genuine questions about the bakery's business model, about the scholarship selection criteria, about Mason's upcoming architectural projects. We answered honestly, neither exaggerating our successes nor downplaying our challenges. As we waited for dessert, Richard cleared his throat. We've been thinking about what you said, about Uncle Jack's wishes for his legacy. Mason raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, waiting. We'd like to contribute, Margaret said, to the scholarship fund, to honor Jack's memory. Mason and I exchanged surprised glances. That's unexpected, he finally said. We've discussed it thoroughly, Richard continued. A matching grant, perhaps. For every dollar raised locally, we would match it up to a certain amount. Why? Mason asked directly. You've never shown interest in community education before. Richard's jawline tightened, but then he sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. Because Audrey was right about a lot of things. We've been rigid in our thinking. Your project has merit, Margaret added. It deserves support. Mason studied them carefully. And there are no strings attached? No conditions? None, Richard confirmed. The money would go directly to the college's foundation, earmarked for your scholarship fund. We'd like to be involved, Margaret clarified. Advisory capacity only, but we have experience with charitable foundations that might be valuable. I could see Mason weighing their offer, contemplating motivations versus outcomes. Finally, he nodded slowly. Let's start with a smaller test program. Something limited, in scope that we can evaluate together. Relief flickered across Richard's face. That seems reasonable. And I'd like Audrey involved too, Mason added, if she's interested. Of course, Margaret agreed quickly. Family effort. By the time we said goodbye outside the restaurant, the awkwardness hadn't disappeared entirely, but something had shifted. There was an uncertainty in Richard and Margaret's usual polished demeanor, a vulnerability that made them more human somehow. They're trying, I said as we watched their rental car pull away. In their own way. They're adapting, Mason corrected, but without bitterness. The world they understand is changing, and they're smart enough to change with it. Do you trust their intentions? He considered this. Not entirely. Not yet. But I believe in giving people the chance to evolve. He squeezed my hand. You taught me that. The following months brought gradual, sometimes awkward progress in rebuilding family connections. Richard and Margaret didn't transform overnight into warm, accepting in-laws, but they made consistent small efforts. They sent thoughtful housewarming, gifts for our new home. They remembered my birthday with a carefully chosen cookbook from a renowned pastry chef. They asked questions about the bakery's operations and actually listened to the answers. Mason maintained clear boundaries while cautiously opening doors. He began calling them every other Sunday, brief, cordial conversations that gradually increased in length and depth. When they invited us to Connecticut for Thanksgiving, he countered by suggesting they come to Wisconsin instead and experience a holiday with my family. Surprisingly, they accepted. Are you sure about this? I asked as we prepared the guest room, in our new home the day before their arrival. My family can be a bit overwhelming. That's exactly why I want them to come, Mason said, smoothing fresh sheets onto the bed. They need to see what a functional family looks like, how people can love each other without conditions or expectations. They might not appreciate the contrast, I warned. They might not, he agreed. But it's time they understood where our values come from. Thanksgiving Day dawned bright and clear, with just enough chill in the air to justify the crackling fire in my parents' living room. My mother had been cooking for days, incorporating dishes from both our family traditions. My brothers had been instructed to be on their best behavior, though Mom's definition of best still included their usual good-natured teasing and boisterous energy. Richard and Margaret arrived precisely on time, bearing expensive wines and a gourmet pumpkin cheesecake from a renowned New York bakery. They'd made efforts with their clothing, still high-end but deliberately more casual than their usual attire. "Welcome to the Parker family Thanksgiving," my father greeted them warmly. "Taking their coats? We're glad you could join us." I watched them take in the scene, the modest but comfortable home, the mismatched chairs brought in to accommodate everyone, the football game playing on the television where my youngest brother was sprawled on the floor with the family dog. "Thank you for having us," Margaret said, her practiced social smile in place. "Your home is lovely." "It's nothing fancy," Mom replied without apology. "But it's full of love and good food, and that's what matters." The early interactions were stilted, with Richard and Margaret clearly uncertain how to navigate a household so different from their own. They sat stiffly on the couch while chaos swirled around them, my brothers arguing about a referee's call, my grandmother insisting everyone try her special cranberry sauce, neighborhood kids stopping by to see if my brothers could come out after dinner. But gradually, the warmth of the Parker family tradition began to thaw even their reserve. My father engaged Richard in a surprisingly detailed conversation about woodworking, discovering a shared appreciation for craftsmanship. My grandmother drew out Margaret with questions about her charity work, genuinely interested in the organizations she supported. By the time we gathered around the extended dining table, actually 3 tables pushed together and covered with mismatched but festive tablecloths, some of the tension had dissipated. My father asked everyone to join hands for the traditional sharing of gratitudes. "Stranger or family doesn't matter at our table," he explained to Richard and Margaret. "Everyone gets a turn to share something they're thankful for this year." The circle moved around the table, simple, heartfelt expressions of gratitude for health, for loved ones, for new opportunities. When it came to Richard's turn, he hesitated, clearly unused to this kind of open emotional expression. "I'm grateful for second chances," he finally said, his voice slightly rough, "and for expanded definitions of family." Margaret nodded in agreement when her turn came. "For bridges being built," she added quietly, "and for the patience of those building them." Mason squeezed my hand under the table, and I saw moisture gathering in the corners of his eyes. "For unconditional love," he said when his turn came. "Both the kind I grew up with and the kind I'm still learning to recognize." The meal that followed was abundant and joyful. My brothers gradually drew Audrey, who had flown in that morning, into their typical sibling banter. My grandmother insisted on seating Margaret next to her, peppering her with questions about East Coast life while simultaneously pressing second helpings onto her plate. After dinner, while the football game continued in the background, smaller conversations broke out around the living room. I found Richard examining the family photos that lined the hallway. "You were a competitive swimmer," he observed, pointing to a picture of me at 16, holding a trophy. "State qualifier." I nodded. "Nothing national level, but I loved it." "Our Audrey rode horses," he said. "Dressage. She was quite good." "I didn't know that. She gave it up when she started pre-med." A shadow crossed his face. "Perhaps we encouraged that choice too strongly." It wasn't quite an admission of error, but it was close. I decided to meet him halfway. She mentioned she might start riding again. "There's a wonderful stable about 20 minutes from here that offers adult lessons." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps I'll mention it to her." As the evening wound down, my mother handed Margaret a container of leftovers. "Family tradition," she explained. "Everyone takes home enough for a sandwich tomorrow." Margaret looked momentarily startled, but then accepted the plastic container with surprising grace. "Thank you. Everything was delicious." On the drive home, Mason's parents were quieter than usual, processing the experiences of the day. Finally, as we turned onto our street, Richard spoke. "Your family is very connected to each other." "They are," I agreed. "They always have been." "I see why Mason is drawn to that," Margaret said softly. "It's quite different from how we've done things." Mason parked in our driveway but didn't immediately move to get out of the car. "Different isn't always better or worse," he said carefully. "But I'd like our future family to have elements of both worlds. The opportunities and education you valued, with the unconditional support Ellie's family demonstrates." His parents absorbed this, nodding slowly. "Perhaps we could learn from each other," Richard suggested, the words clearly difficult for him to articulate. It wasn't a transformation. The Wilsons weren't suddenly going to become warm, demonstrative people after a lifetime of emotional restraint. But it was a beginning, a willingness to recognize value in a different approach to family. As winter settled over Wisconsin, the scholarship program developed in unexpected ways. Richard's proposal for matching funds evolved into a more comprehensive initiative, with his connections opening doors to additional corporate sponsorships. What had started as a modest fund for a handful of students expanded to include mentorship programs, internship opportunities, and specialized training. The formal launch event was held in the community college's newly renovated auditorium. Mason and I sat in the front row, watching as both our families shared the stage with college administrators and local business leaders. My father looked uncomfortable in his best suit, but beamed with pride as he described the construction apprenticeship program he was helping to develop. Richard spoke with surprising passion about the importance of creating pathways for talented individuals regardless of background. "I've learned recently," he said, glancing toward us, "that potential and merit exist everywhere, not just in exclusive institutions. Our goal should be to recognize and nurture that potential wherever we find it." Afterward, at the reception, Audrey approached us with a tall, bearded man in worn jeans and a button-down shirt. "This is Kevin," she introduced him. "He runs the therapeutic writing program I've been volunteering with." Mason raised an eyebrow at me over his champagne glass, and I suppressed a smile. Audrey was glowing in a way I'd never seen before, her usual polish replaced by a more authentic energy. "Kevin was telling me about your bakery," she continued. "His sister has celiac disease, and he's been looking for good gluten-free options for her." "We've been expanding that line," I confirmed. "Stop by tomorrow, and I'll give you some samples to try." As they walked away, Mason nudged me. "Did you see that? She's actually happy. And your parents haven't imploded at the sight of those non-designer jeans." Mason chuckled. "Small miracles." Later that evening, as guests began to depart, I found myself standing with Margaret near the dessert table, where my bakery's contributions had been nearly decimated. "Your pastries were very popular," she observed, "particularly those lavender things." "Lavender honey scones," I nodded. "They're our best sellers." Margaret hesitated, then asked, "Would you consider teaching me how to make them when we next visit?" The request was so unexpected I almost didn't process it. "You want to learn to bake?" "I've never really tried," she admitted. "Our housekeeper always handled that sort of thing, but I find I'm interested in creating something with my own hands." I thought about what this represented, not just a culinary interest, but an attempt to connect with my world, to understand what I valued. "I'd like that," I said sincerely. "We could make a morning of it." Her smile was small but genuine. "Thank you." 1 year after Mason's inheritance, we hosted a private dinner at our home, a conscious echo of that first difficult meal in Connecticut, but with significant differences. Both families were present this time, seated around our dining table. Mason and I had prepared the meal together, incorporating dishes that represented both our backgrounds. "Before we begin," Mason said, standing to raise his glass, "I want to thank everyone for being here. A year ago, I wasn't sure this scene would ever be possible." He looked around at the faces gathered. My parents, comfortable but proud in their Sunday best. His parents, gradually learning to relax their rigid standards. Audrey and Kevin, their relationship deepening into something serious. My brothers, always ready with a joke to break tension. "Uncle Jack's inheritance changed our lives in obvious ways," Mason continued. "It allowed us to accelerate our dreams, to create opportunities for others, to build something meaningful. But the most valuable inheritance we've received this year hasn't been financial at all." He paused, his eyes meeting mine briefly. "It's been the understanding that family can be both what you're born into and what you choose. That bridges can be built across the widest divides. That people can grow and change when given the chance." Richard cleared his throat, uncharacteristically. Emotional. "I'd like to say something as well." He stood, somewhat stiffly. "Margaret and I made serious mistakes. We allowed our preconceptions and pride to nearly cost us our son." Margaret reached for his hand, nodding in agreement. "We're still learning," Richard continued. "But we're grateful for the patience extended. To us, particularly by you, Ellie. You had every right to shut the door on any relationship with us after how we treated you. Your grace has been instructive." My father raised his glass. "To my family," he said simply. "The kind you're given, and the kind you build." As we clinked glasses around the table, I caught Mason's eye across the candlelight. The journey hadn't been smooth or easy. There had been difficult conversations, setbacks, moments of frustration on both sides. The Wilsons would never be as demonstrative or casual as the Parkers, and my family would never fully understand the world Mason had come from. But we were creating something new together, a blend of values, traditions, and ways of showing love. It wasn't perfect, but it was authentic, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or appearances. Later, as we cleared dishes and prepared to serve dessert, a cake my grandmother had made from her treasured recipe, Mason slipped an arm around my waist. "Happy," he murmured against my hair. I leaned into him, watching our families mingle in the living room. Richard showing my brother photos of his vintage car collection, Margaret and my mother discussing plans for the next scholarship fundraiser, Audrey and Kevin talking animatedly with my father about the therapeutic riding program. "Beyond happy," I replied. "This is better than anything money could buy." Mason nodded, understanding completely. The ultimate inheritance wasn't in Uncle Jack's accounts or investments. It was in the courage to live authentically, to choose love over expectation, to build bridges where walls once stood. As I carried the cake to the table, calling everyone back for dessert, I realized we had created something precious. Not just a marriage or a family, but a community of people who were learning to see and value each other across differences of background, education, and wealth. That was worth more than all the inheritances in the world. 2 years after receiving Uncle Jack's inheritance, Mason and I found ourselves facing a new chapter in our lives. The bakery had expanded to a second location in a neighboring town. The scholarship fund was thriving under the joint guidance of both our families, and Mason's architectural firm had gained national recognition for innovative community-centered designs. But the biggest change was more personal. I was 6 months pregnant with twins. The news of our pregnancy had emerged during a routine checkup. What we'd thought would be a simple confirmation of our first child turned into the surprising revelation that we were expecting both a boy and a girl. Mason had gripped my hand so tightly as we stared at the ultrasound screen, both of us rendered, speechless by the 2 distinct heartbeats. "Twins don't run in my family," I'd said afterward, still dazed as we walked to the car. "They do in mine," Mason admitted. My father is an identical twin, and my grandmother was a fraternal twin, like our babies will be. It was strange to think about, this genetic connection to a family that had once rejected our union now manifesting in the most intimate way possible. When we shared the news, the reactions were telling. My family immediately jumped into practical support mode. My mother started knitting matching blankets. My father began sketching designs for custom cribs, and my brothers argued good-naturedly about who would be the favorite uncle. Richard and Margaret's response was more measured, but revealed how far they'd come. Instead of focusing on which prestigious preschools the children should be waitlisted for, Margaret asked thoughtful questions about my health and offered to connect us with a highly regarded obstetrician who specialized in twin pregnancies. Richard unexpectedly presented us with 2 savings bonds he'd established for the baby's education, with the explicit note that they could be used for any educational path the children choose to pursue. No pressure or expectations, he'd said somewhat stiffly. Just options. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was meaningful progress from people who'd once tried to dictate every aspect of their own children's lives. Audrey, now officially engaged to Kevin, took on the role of enthusiastic aunt-to-be with unexpected vigor. She began researching the latest in child development science and regularly sent us articles on everything from prenatal nutrition to bilingual language exposure. I want to be the cool aunt who actually knows useful things, she explained during one of her now frequent visits. Not just the one who shows up with expensive toys. As my pregnancy progressed, we faced a practical dilemma. Our house, while comfortable for the 2 of us, wasn't ideally configured for a family with twins. After weighing our options, we decided to look for a new home that would better accommodate our expanding family. What we didn't expect was Richard and Margaret's proposal. We've been thinking, Richard said during one of their visits, about the summer house in Vermont. The Vermont property was a colonial-era farmhouse on 30 acres that had been in the Wilson family for generations. Mason had mentioned it occasionally, childhood summers spent exploring the woods, holidays by the massive stone fireplace, family traditions that actually held warm memories for him. What about it? Mason asked cautiously. We rarely use it anymore, Margaret explained. With our winters in Palm Beach and summers usually spent traveling? We'd like you to have it, Richard finished. For your family. Mason stared at them. You want to give us the Vermont house? It needs updating, Margaret acknowledged. The kitchen is hopelessly outdated, and the master bathroom should be completely redone. But the bones are good, and there's plenty of room for children to grow. And it should stay in the family, Richard added. It was always meant to be passed down. Mason turned to me, his expression a complex mixture of surprise, nostalgia, and uncertainty. It's a beautiful property, he told me. Acres of maple, trees, a small lake, an old barn that could be converted into an amazing studio space. It sounds lovely, I said carefully. But our lives are here in Wisconsin. My bakery, your firm, both our families. We've considered that, Richard said. The property includes a separate guest house that could serve as a satellite office for Mason's firm, and it's only a 2-hour flight to Wisconsin. This isn't about trying to pull you back to the East Coast, Margaret added, seeming to recognize our wariness. It's about offering a gift we thought you might appreciate. If you prefer to stay here, we completely understand. Mason and I promised to think about it, neither of us wanting to make an impulsive decision. After his parents left, we sat on our back porch, watching fireflies emerge in the summer twilight. What are you thinking? I asked, resting my hands on my rounded belly. I'm thinking about those summers in Vermont, Mason replied. They were the happiest times of my childhood. Away from the social pressures and expectations, even my parents were more relaxed there. But our whole support system is here, I pointed. Out. Your firm, my bakery, the scholarship foundation? Mason nodded thoughtfully. What if it wasn't an either-or decision? Over the next few weeks, a plan began to take shape. We would accept the Vermont property but convert it into a dual-purpose space, a family retreat, and a purpose-driven project. The main house would be updated for our growing family to use during summers and holidays, while the surrounding property would be transformed into an educational retreat center associated with our scholarship foundation. We could host summer workshops for scholarship recipients, I suggested, warming to the idea. Art programs, business incubation sessions, leadership, retreats. The old barn could become studio spaces, Mason added, excitement growing in his voice. We could bring in architects, artists, entrepreneurs to teach intensive workshops. When we presented the concept to both families over dinner, the response was overwhelmingly positive. My father immediately began talking about the practical aspects of renovating the barn, while my mother envisioned garden spaces where participants could grow their own food. Richard, in a moment of surprising self-awareness, smiled at our enthusiasm. You're taking something that represents Wilson family privilege and making it accessible to others, he observed. Jack would have approved. It feels right, Mason said simply. Using what we've been given to create opportunities, not just for our own children but for others. The conversion of the Vermont property became a family project spanning generations. My father and brothers traveled east with Mason to assess the structures and begin initial renovations. Richard surprised everyone by showing up in work clothes, eager to contribute his unexpected knowledge of the property's history and original design. My grandfather built this stone wall, he told my father one afternoon, running his hand over the weathered rocks. Insisted on doing it himself rather than hiring stonemasons. He was, not unlike you actually, believed in the value of working with his hands. My father, initially wary of this man who had once dismissed his daughter as unworthy, gradually found common ground in their shared appreciation for craftsmanship and practical knowledge. By the end of that first week, they were good-naturedly arguing about the best approach to reinforcing the barn's original post and beam structure. Meanwhile, Margaret and my mother focused on the main house's interior, forming an unlikely design partnership. My mother's practical approach to comfort balanced Margaret's more formal aesthetic, resulting in spaces that felt both elegant and welcoming. We need sturdy, washable fabrics for the main living areas, my mother insisted. With twins and eventually more children running around. I completely agree, Margaret surprised her by saying, but they can still be beautiful. Look at these performance fabrics. They resist stains but feel like fine linen. As my due date approached, the Vermont project continued under the oversight of a construction manager Mason trusted, while we turned our attention to preparing for the twins' arrival. We converted our home office into a nursery, painted in gentle greens and yellows, since we wanted to avoid gender stereotypes. Audrey organized a baby shower that somehow managed to bridge the still evident differences between our families' approaches to celebration. The event featured both Margaret's champagne toast with fine crystal flutes and my grandmother's raucous baby-themed bingo game with prizes from the dollar store. Somehow, the combination worked, with each group gradually relaxing into the other's traditions. Kevin, now officially part of the family planning since his engagement to Audrey, contributed handcrafted wooden toys made in his workshop. From Uncle Kevin, he said, with the easy confidence of someone who knew his worth didn't depend on the price tag of his gifts. I noticed Richard watching this exchange with a thoughtful expression. Later, he approached Kevin with genuine questions about his woodworking techniques, the first time I'd seen him engage with my extended family without any visible discomfort or condescension. The twins, Emma Grace and Jackson Thomas, arrived on a snowy December morning after 26 hours of labor. They were small but healthy, with Emma arriving first, followed by her brother 17 minutes later. When I held them both in my arms for the first time, exhausted but exhilarated, I looked up to see Mason's tear-streaked face. They're perfect, he whispered, gently touching each tiny head. Absolutely perfect. The hospital room soon filled with family, first my parents and brothers, then Richard, Margaret, and Audrey, who had all been staying nearby in anticipation of the birth. Watching my father show Richard how to properly support Jackson's head, while holding him, I was struck by how far we'd all come. 3 years earlier, these families hadn't even been willing to sit at the same table. Now they were united in celebration of new life, the barriers of class and background gradually eroding in the face of more fundamental connections. The twins' first 6 months were a blur of midnight feedings, diaper changes, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion only new parents truly understand. But we weren't alone in navigating this new territory. My mother stayed with us for the first 3 weeks, her practical experience an invaluable guide. Margaret visited regularly, initially awkward around the demands of newborns, but gradually finding her own rhythm with the babies, particularly with Emma, who would calm immediately in her grandmother's arms. She has good taste, Margaret joked, once, smoothing the baby's wispy hair. She recognizes quality when she sees it. Instead of bristling at what would once have felt like a subtle dig, I found myself laughing. Well, Jackson prefers my dad's off-key humming to any professional lullaby, so I think they're covering all their bases. By the time the twins were 7 months old, the Vermont property's first phase of renovation was complete. The main house had been updated with family life in mind, practical but beautiful, with spaces designed for both children and adults. The old barn had been converted into a multi-purpose workshop and gathering space, and the grounds were prepared for the first summer program, which would bring 15 scholarship recipients for a 2-week entrepreneurship retreat. Our journey from Wisconsin to Vermont with 7-month-old twins was an adventure in itself, but the moment we drove down the maple-lined drive and saw the historic farmhouse, something settled in me. Though I'd never been there before, I could feel why this place held such meaning for Mason. There was a timelessness to it, a sense of roots and history that complemented rather than contradicted the new purpose we were bringing to it. The inaugural summer program exceeded all our expectations. The scholarship recipients, ranging from 18 to 42 years old, from diverse backgrounds and with varied aspirations, brought energy and fresh perspectives to the property. They lived in the newly renovated guest cottages, gathering in the barn for workshops led by business leaders, artists, and educators from across the country. Mason and I took turns managing the program and caring for the twins, who became unofficial mascots, passed from participant to participant during meals and evening gatherings. My parents came for 2 weeks to help, my father offering impromptu construction lessons in his spare time. Even Richard and Margaret participated, Richard surprisingly effective at leading sessions on financial literacy, while Margaret, to everyone's astonishment, taught a workshop on strategic philanthropy that became one of the program's highlights. "You're actually a good teacher," Mason told his mother after observing one of her sessions. "I had no idea." "Neither did I," she admitted. It's rather invigorating to discover new aspects of oneself at this stage of life. On the final evening of the program, we gathered around a bonfire by the lake. Participants shared their projects and plans, each presentation reflecting the personal growth of the previous weeks. One young woman, a first-generation college student studying culinary arts, had developed a complete business plan for a food truck featuring fusion cuisine from her Filipino heritage. "I never thought I could actually do this," she told the group, her face glowing in the firelight. "Having successful people believe in my ideas, help me refine them instead of just dismissing them. It changes how you see yourself." I glanced at Richard and Margaret, seated across the fire, and saw them absorbing her words. The woman's background wasn't unlike my own. Working class, community college, big dreams but limited connections. 3 years ago, they would have dismissed her potential without a second thought. Later that night, after the participants had returned to their cottages and the babies were asleep in the nursery we'd created from what was once a formal sitting, Room Mason and I sat on the wide porch, listening to the chorus of frogs and crickets from the nearby lake. Uncle Jack would have loved this, Mason said quietly. Using the money this way, creating something meaningful. Do you ever wish we'd done something different? I asked. Traveled more, bought a yacht, lived more extravagantly? Mason shook, his head reaching for my hand. Not for a second. We've created something sustainable, something that will outlast us. From the baby monitor on the table between us came the soft sounds of Emma's gentle snoring and Jackson's occasional sighs. Inside the house were photographs spanning generations. Mason's grandparents in front of the house in the 1940s, our wedding day, the twins' birth, the scholarship recipients gathered on the lawn. Different worlds, different values, gradually, finding common ground. It's still not perfect, I acknowledged. Your parents still occasionally say things that make me cringe, and my brothers still think some of their traditions are ridiculous. Perfect would be boring, Mason replied with a smile. We're building something real instead. Something with texture and complexity and occasional friction. Something alive. In the distance, a shooting star streaked across the sky above the silhouetted maple trees. I thought about inheritance, not just money or property, but values, lessons, possibilities. What we receive, what we transform, what we pass on. The true legacy of Uncle Jack's unexpected gift wasn't measured in dollars, but in connections forged, perspectives broadened, opportunities created. It had given us not just financial security, but the chance to build bridges between worlds that might otherwise never have understood each other. We should get some sleep, Mason said eventually, standing and pulling me to my feet. The twins will be up at dawn, and we have the foundation board meeting tomorrow. We walked inside, checking on Emma and Jackson before heading to our bedroom. The old house creaked and settled around us, a century of history in its walls now holding our family's story too. Outside, the Vermont night continued its timeless rhythm, stars wheeling overhead, wind rustling through maple leaves, the promise of tomorrow's possibilities waiting to unfold. In that moment, I felt the weight and wonder of it all. How a wedding, with empty chairs, had led us here, to this fullness, this richness of connection. How rejection had opened doors to something greater than acceptance. How an inheritance, once a source of division, had become the foundation for a legacy of unity and purpose. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected, least of all me, the small-town barista who'd fallen in love with an architect from a world so different from her own. But it was an ending, or rather, a continuing, filled with possibility and hope. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable inheritances are the ones we create together, built on love, understanding, and the courage to forge new paths across old divides. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. Emma and Jackson were now 7-year-olds with distinct personalities that sometimes made it hard to believe they were twins. Emma had inherited Mason's analytical mind and my creativity, a combination that made her both thoughtful and boldly expressive. Jackson was quieter, observant, with a natural talent for understanding how things worked, whether mechanical objects or people's emotions. Our lives had found a rhythm between Wisconsin and Vermont, with the scholarship program flourishing beyond our initial expectations. What had begun as a simple fund for community college students had evolved into a comprehensive educational foundation, supporting everything from vocational training to advanced degrees, with specialized tracks for entrepreneurship, arts, and community development. The Vermont property had become not just a family retreat, but a vibrant educational center, hosting 3 sessions each summer and weekend workshops throughout the spring and fall. The original barn had been joined by additional structures, a modern classroom building, dormitory-style accommodations, and a communal dining hall where participants and instructors shared meals prepared with ingredients from the property's organic gardens. My bakery had expanded to 3 locations, each with its own distinct character, but unified by our commitment to quality and community connection. I'd published a cookbook featuring recipes developed during special baking workshops we held for scholarship recipients, with proceeds funding a dedicated culinary arts program within the foundation. Mason's architectural practice had evolved as well, focusing increasingly on community-centered projects that blended innovation with accessibility. He'd been recognized nationally for a series of affordable housing developments that incorporated sustainable materials and thoughtful design elements typically reserved for luxury buildings. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in our professional lives or material success. It was in the relationships between our extended families. What had begun as a reluctant truce had gradually evolved into genuine connection, with boundaries still respected, but bridges firmly established. Richard and Margaret had surprised everyone, including themselves, by purchasing a summer home just 20 minutes from our Wisconsin property. Though they still maintained their Connecticut residence and wintered in Palm Beach, they spent increasing amounts of time in the Midwest, particularly during the twins' school year. We missed too much of Mason's childhood due to work and social obligations, Margaret had explained when they announced their decision. We don't intend to make the same mistake with our grandchildren. Richard, now semi-retired, had developed an unexpected bond with my father. Their initial conversations about construction and craftsmanship had expanded to include fishing trips, woodworking projects in my father's garage workshop, and spirited debates about everything from politics to the best way to grill a steak. They remained different in many ways. Richard still preferred fine wine while my father was devoted to his locally brewed beer, but they had found common ground in their shared values of integrity, hard work, and family devotion. More surprisingly, Richard had become involved with the mentorship program at the community college, offering guidance to business students navigating their career paths. His experience and connections, once wielded exclusively within elite circles, were now accessible to young people from backgrounds similar to mine. They ask better questions than the Harvard students I've mentored, he admitted after one particularly engaging session. They're hungry for knowledge, not just credentials. The annual summer gathering at the Vermont property had become a highlight for both families, with my brothers and their growing families joining us for 2 weeks of shared meals, outdoor adventures, and both structured and spontaneous activities. Watching my youngest brother teach Richard how to kayak on the property's lake, the distinguished former surgeon wobbling precariously before finding his balance, had been one of the most unexpectedly delightful moments of recent years. It was during this year's summer gathering that Audrey and Kevin made their announcement. We were all seated on the expanded deck overlooking the lake, enjoying dessert after a meal featuring vegetables from the garden and fresh bread I'd baked that, "Morning, we have some news?" Audrey said, reaching for Kevin's hand. Their relationship had deepened over the years, their wedding 3 years ago a beautiful blend of Wilson formality and Kevin's more relaxed approach to celebration. "We're adopting," Kevin continued, his smile wide beneath his now familiar beard. "A sibling group, actually. 3 children from the foster care system." The news was met with a moment of stunned silence, followed by a wave of congratulations and questions. The children were siblings aged 8, 6, and 4, who had been in foster care for nearly 2 years after losing their parents in a car accident. Audrey and Kevin had been working with an adoption agency for months, keeping the process private until they were certain it would move forward. "We've been approved," Audrey explained, her eyes bright with emotion. "We meet them next week, and if all goes well, they'll come home with us by the end of the month." I watched Richard and Margaret's reactions carefully. In the old days, they might have had serious reservations about their daughter adopting children, with unknown genetic backgrounds, about the complexity of integrating older children into the Wilson family lineage. But years of evolution had shifted their perspectives in ways none of us could have predicted. "That's wonderful news," Margaret said warmly. 3 children at once will be challenging, but you've always risen to challenges. "Do you have photos?" Richard asked, surprising everyone with his evident enthusiasm. "Names? What are their interests?" As Audrey shared details about Sophia, Ethan, and little Noah, I exchanged a glance with Mason. This moment represented something we could never have imagined when we first faced his parents' rejection. A family expanding its definition of belonging beyond bloodlines and social status. Later that evening, after the twins had been tucked into bed with stories and goodnight kisses, the adults gathered around the fire pit near the lake's edge. The conversation flowed easily between serious topics and lighthearted reminiscences, the group no longer separated by invisible barriers of class or background. "I've been thinking about legacy," Richard said unexpectedly during a lull in the conversation. "About what we leave behind." "Careful, Dad," Mason teased. "That sounds dangerously philosophical for a Wilson family gathering." Richard smiled, acknowledging the joke about his former resistance to emotional discussions. "I've earned the right to wax philosophical at my age, especially after witnessing the changes of these past years." He looked around the circle, at Mason and me, at Audrey and Kevin, at my parents who were comfortable now in this setting that would once have intimidated them. "When I was younger, legacy meant something very specific. The Wilson name, the family reputation, financial security, passed down through generations, connections maintained in the right circles." Margaret nodded beside him, her hand finding his in a rare public display of affection. "We were quite rigid in our thinking," she acknowledged, certain we knew the correct path. Uncle Jack understood. "Something we didn't," Richard continued. "That true legacy isn't about preserving the status quo. It's about growth, adaptation, finding new ways to express enduring values." My mother, who had developed an unexpected friendship with Margaret through their collaborative work on various projects, smiled gently. "It's like gardening," she offered. "You can't just preserve the same plants forever. You have to allow for new growth, cross-pollination, adaptation to changing conditions." "Exactly," Richard agreed, warming to her analogy. "And sometimes the most beautiful gardens come from unexpected combinations." The conversation turned to plans for the coming year, the next phase of the educational center's development, the impending arrival of Audrey and Kevin's children, a potential expansion of the scholarship program to include international students. Though differences in approach and perspective still emerged, they were no longer sources of conflict, but opportunities for thoughtful negotiation and creative compromise. As the fire burned low and stars emerged in the clear Vermont sky, I found myself sitting beside Margaret, slightly apart from the main conversation. "I never properly thanked you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing potential in Mason that we missed. For loving him despite our behavior. For being patient with our evolution." She smiled ruefully. "We weren't easy people to welcome into your life." "Family rarely is," I replied. "But it's worth the effort." She nodded thoughtfully. "Jack's inheritance changed everything, didn't it? Not just financially, but in ways none of us could have anticipated." "I think it accelerated changes that might have happened anyway," I suggested. "Or created space for them to emerge. The money gave us freedom to build something new together, but the willingness to try had to come from all of us." "Wisdom from the bakery owner," Margaret said, but her tone held affection rather than condescension. "I should have listened to you sooner." When we returned to Wisconsin after the summer gathering, life resumed its busy pace. The twins started second grade at the public school we'd chosen for its excellent arts program and diverse student body. I juggled bakery operations with foundation responsibilities, while Mason worked on a major project designing a community arts center in a revitalized urban neighborhood. Audrey and Kevin's adoption process moved forward, with all 3 children officially joining their family by early fall. The transition wasn't without challenges, but watching Audrey, once the perfect Wilson daughter, obedient to every parental expectation, navigate the complex emotions of 3 traumatized children with patience and creativity was remarkable. "They're really good at this," Mason observed after a weekend visit to their home. Who would have thought Audrey would become such an intuitive parent? People surprise you when given the chance, I replied, thinking of my own journey from small town. Barista to business owner and foundation director, especially when they're free to discover their authentic strengths. In November, an unexpected opportunity arose. The foundation was approached by a national education nonprofit interested in replicating our scholarship model in 5 other states. The proposal would require significant expansion of our operations, additional staffing, and more extensive travel for both Mason and me as we helped establish the satellite programs. "It's a chance to multiply our impact," Mason said as we discussed the proposal over late-night tea at our kitchen table. "But the timing—" "The twins are settled in school," I noted. "The bakeries are running smoothly with the management team in place, and we have more family support than ever. It would mean more time away from home," Mason pointed out. "More complexity in our already busy lives." "True, but if we structure it right, it could also mean more meaning, more purpose." I sipped my tea thoughtfully. Remember what Uncle Jack wrote? About using his money to build a life of meaning, not appearances. The discussion continued for several days, involving not just the two of us, but our extended support network. My parents immediately offered to increase their involvement with the twins during our necessary travel periods. Richard and Margaret, to our surprise, volunteered to oversee aspects of the Vermont Properties educational programs, working in partnership with the staff we'd established there. "We've learned a thing or two about education over the past few years," Richard said when he made the offer. "Might as well put that knowledge to use." Even my brothers stepped up, proposing a rotation system where they could help cover family responsibilities during particularly busy periods. The collaborative approach to decision-making reflected how far we'd all come, from isolated family units to an interconnected community supporting shared values and goals. We ultimately decided to move forward with the expansion, with careful boundaries established to protect our family life and well-being. The national program would launch the following year, with pilot sites selected in regions where educational opportunities were particularly limited. As we prepared for this new chapter, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. One evening, while organizing files in our home office, I came across the original letter from Uncle Jack's attorney, the certified mail that had arrived 3 months after our wedding, changing the trajectory of our lives. Mason found me sitting, with the letter, smiling at the memory of our shocked reactions to the inheritance amount. "Nostalgic?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Just thinking about parallel lives," I replied. "What might have happened if this letter had never arrived? If we'd continued on the path we originally planned, small bakery eventually, your architectural career developing gradually, modest, but meaningful lives. We'd have been happy," Mason said with certainty. "Different, but happy. The money accelerated certain things, but it didn't change who we are at our core." "No," I agreed, "but it did change the scope of what we could build together. And it certainly changed your parents." "Money didn't change them," Mason corrected gently. "Seeing what we did with it changed them. The legacy we created challenged their understanding of value and worth." Outside our window, the Wisconsin autumn was painting the landscape in brilliant reds and golds. In the distance, I could see the lights of the town where I'd once served coffee to the quiet architect who would become my husband. The journey from that first meeting to our current reality wasn't one anyone could have predicted. Not my family with their modest expectations, not Mason's parents with their rigid social hierarchy, not even Mason and I with our initial dream of simple, meaningful lives. Uncle Jack's inheritance had opened doors, created opportunities, accelerated timelines. But the true wealth we'd accumulated couldn't be measured in financial terms. It existed in the connections we'd built, the barriers we'd dismantled, the understanding we'd cultivated across differences that once seemed insurmountable. As Mason and I turned out the office light and headed downstairs to check on our sleeping, children, I thought about the story we would someday share with Emma and Jackson, about wedding chairs left empty, about a surprise inheritance, about bridges built between worlds that seemed destined to remain separate. Most importantly, about the power of choosing love over expectation, authenticity over appearance, and possibility over limitation. It wasn't the story I'd imagined for myself as a young woman working in a coffee shop with dreams of owning a small bakery someday. It was far more complex, more challenging, and ultimately more rewarding. A reminder that life's most valuable inheritances often arrive in unexpected packages. Their true worth revealed not in the moment of receiving, but in the choices we make about how to use them. The real inheritance, I realized as I tucked the blanket around Jackson's sleeping form, wasn't Uncle Jack's money. It was the opportunity that had come with it, to demonstrate the true meaning of wealth, to build bridges where walls had stood, and to create a legacy defined not by exclusion, but by an ever-expanding circle of belonging. That was an inheritance, worth passing on. 10 years after Uncle Jack's inheritance changed our lives, we gathered at the Vermont property for a special anniversary celebration. The maple trees lining the driveway had grown fuller, the gardens more established, and the collection of buildings, both historic and new, formed a harmonious campus that blended seamlessly with the natural landscape. The occasion wasn't just about commemorating the inheritance itself, but celebrating the foundation that had grown from it. Now officially named the Wilson Parker Educational Foundation, a nationally recognized organization that had helped over 3,000 students across the country pursue their dreams. Emma and Jackson, now 12, had taken on the role of unofficial hosts for the weekend, proudly showing visitors around the property they'd grown up exploring during summers and holidays. They'd been joined 3 years earlier by their little sister, Lily, a surprise addition to our family who had inherited my curly hair and Mason's quiet determination. "Over here is where we do the leadership workshops," Emma explained to a group of foundation donors, gesturing toward the converted barn with the confidence of someone twice her age. "Last summer, I got to sit in on the Women in Business seminar. It was super inspiring." Jackson, meanwhile, was leading another group through the organic gardens. "We grow about 40% of the food served during summer sessions," he informed them, his knowledge of the agricultural program impressively detailed. "The composting system was my project for science class last year, watching them from the main house porch." Mason slipped his arm around my waist. "They've absorbed it all, haven't they? The values, the mission, the sense of purpose. They've grown up surrounded by it," I replied. "It's in their DNA now, regardless of genetics." The weekend gathering had brought together an eclectic mix of people connected to the Foundation's work, scholarship recipients from the past decade, educators and mentors who had contributed to the programs, donors who had been inspired to support the expanding mission, and of course our extended families. What had begun as a simple scholarship fund had evolved into a comprehensive educational ecosystem, with programs ranging from early childhood development to mid-career retraining initiatives. The Vermont property, once a symbol of Wilson family privilege, had become the heart of the Foundation's work, though satellite campuses in Wisconsin, New Mexico, Georgia, and Oregon now extended its reach across the country. Each location maintained the core philosophy while adapting to local needs and cultural contexts. As the afternoon progressed, guests mingled on the expansive lawn, sharing stories and connections across backgrounds that might never have intersected, if not for the Foundation's work. I spotted Richard deep in conversation with a former scholarship recipient who had gone on to become a successful sustainable agriculture entrepreneur. Nearby, Margaret was showing Lily how to make flower crowns, the two of them surrounded by a colorful array of blooms from the cutting garden. Audrey and Kevin arrived mid-afternoon with their 5 children, the 3 they had adopted, now thriving. Teenagers and preteens, and the 2 younger ones they had welcomed through foster to adopt in subsequent years. Their family had become a beautiful testament to the different ways families could be formed, challenging the Wilson family's former obsession with bloodlines and inheritance. "Sorry we're late," Audrey called as their energetic brood spilled out of the minivan. Noah had a soccer tournament that ran long. The eldest of their adopted children, now 16, gave a modest wave as he helped unload bags from the vehicle. Once withdrawn and uncertain, Noah had blossomed under Audrey and Kevin's patient guidance, developing both academic prowess and athletic talents that had already attracted interest from college recruiters. "Did you win?" Mason asked, greeting his nephew with a warm handshake that transformed into a hug. "State semifinals," Noah confirmed with a grin. "Championships next weekend." "We'll be there," I promised, knowing how much it meant to him to have extended family cheering from the sidelines, something he'd missed during his early years in the foster system. The day's formal program began in the late afternoon, with guests gathering in the amphitheater that had been constructed on a natural slope overlooking the lake. Mason and I had decided against traditional speeches, opting instead for a more interactive format where different voices could share the impact of the Foundation's work. A community. College professor described how the mentorship program had transformed retention rates at her institution. A former scholarship recipient, now a pediatric nurse, explained how the Foundation's support had allowed her to complete her degree while raising 3 children as a single mother. The mayor of a small town in Georgia detailed how the satellite campus there had revitalized the local economy while providing educational opportunities previously unavailable to residents. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the gathering, it was Richard who surprised everyone by asking to speak. At 78, he had fully retired from his medical practice, but remained actively involved with the Foundation, serving on the board and particularly championing programs that created pathways for first-generation college students. "I wasn't originally scheduled to speak today," he began, his voice still strong despite his advancing years. But as I listened to these remarkable stories, I felt compelled to add a different perspective, that of someone who once stood on the wrong side of this vision. A hush fell over the amphitheater as Richard looked out at the diverse gathering. "Many of you know pieces of our family story, how my brother Jack's inheritance to my son Mason and his wife Ellie became the seed for everything you see around you. What fewer of you know is that my wife Margaret and I initially refused to attend their wedding." He paused, visibly emotional, something the Richard Wilson of a decade ago would never have allowed himself to show in public. "We were wrong, profoundly, inexcusably wrong. We were blinded by notions of status and background that seem embarrassingly shallow now." Margaret reached for his hand from her seat in the front row, offering silent support as he continued. "I've spent the past decade learning what true value looks like. It isn't measured in degrees from prestigious universities or memberships in exclusive clubs. It's measured in character, in vision, in the courage to build bridges rather than walls." He gestured to the gathering before him. "It's measured in the connections I see here today, connections that transcend the artificial barriers our society constructs to separate us from one another." As Richard returned to his seat, visibly moved by the standing ovation his words received, I felt a tug at my sleeve. It was Lily, her flower crown slightly askew. "Mommy, is Grandpa Richard crying?" she whispered, concerned in her young voice. "Sometimes people cry when they're happy," I explained, lifting her onto my lap. "Or when they're remembering something important. Like when I cried at the butterfly garden because it was so beautiful." "Exactly like that, sweetie." As twilight deepened into evening, lanterns illuminated the paths between buildings, and dinner was served at long tables set up on the central lawn. The meal featured produce from the property's gardens, bread baked by scholarship recipients in the culinary program, and wines from a vineyard founded by one of the Foundation's earliest beneficiaries. My parents, now in their 70s but still vibrant, had been central to planning the celebration, with my mother coordinating the meal and my father overseeing the logistics of hosting such a large gathering. They moved among the tables with natural warmth, making connections between guests and sharing stories that highlighted the Foundation's impact. Your parents have a gift, Margaret observed as she joined me at the dessert table, where an array of pastries from my bakeries was being served. They make everyone feel immediately welcome, regardless of background. They always have, I agreed. It's something I hope our children have inherited from them. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Different kinds of inheritance, aren't there? Not all of them are financial. Those are often the most valuable ones, I replied, thinking of the values and perspectives that had shaped my own life long before Uncle Jack's money entered the picture. After dinner, a casual talent show began. Another tradition that had evolved over the years at the Foundation's summer sessions. Scholarship recipients past and present shared music, poetry, dance, and other creative expressions, while younger children, including Lily and Audrey's younger two, performed with the unself-conscious joy of the truly supported Emma, who had inherited my love for baking but expressed it through more experimental approaches than my traditional techniques, had created an elaborate dessert sculpture representing the Foundation's growth over the decade. Jackson, more reserved but equally talented, presented a short documentary film he'd created interviewing various program participants about their experiences. As the evening progressed, I found myself sitting with Andrea Thompson, one of the Foundation's first scholarship recipients. Now in her early 30s, she had completed her business degree, opened a successful marketing firm, and recently joined the Foundation's board of directors. "I was just thinking about that first summer," she said, gesturing to the property around us. There were only 15 of us then, and we were all so nervous about being here. It felt like we'd accidentally stumbled into someone else's world. "And now?" I asked. "Now it feels like home," she replied simply. "A place where I belong, where my voice matters." Her words captured exactly what we'd hoped to create. Not a charitable handout, but a true community of mutual respect and shared purpose. I watched as she rejoined a group of current scholarship recipients, easily bridging the gap between her success and their aspirations. Later that night, after the formal celebrations had concluded and most guests had retired to their accommodations, Mason and I found ourselves walking the property's trails in the moonlight, something we'd done countless times over the years when we needed to reflect or plan or simply reconnect. "Do you remember that dinner at your parents' house?" I asked, as we reached the lake's edge. "Right after we told them about the inheritance?" Mason laughed softly. "How could I forget? My father nearly choked on his wine when I mentioned the scholarship fund." "I was so nervous," I admitted. "Convinced they'd never accept me, money or no money." "And look at them now," Mason marveled. "Dad giving emotional speeches about bridging divides. Mom making flower crowns with Lily." "People can change," I said, "when given the right motivation and enough time." "Not everyone," Mason pointed out. "But they did. They rose to the occasion eventually." We sat on a bench overlooking the water, the sounds of night creatures creating a peaceful backdrop to our conversation. A decade of building this foundation together had strengthened our partnership in ways neither of us could have anticipated on our wedding day, with those conspicuously empty chairs on Mason's side of the aisle. "What do you think Uncle Jack would make of all this?" I asked. Mason considered the question. "I think he'd be amazed by the scope of it, by how his gift multiplied, but not surprised by the underlying values. He saw that potential in us, even from a distance." "In you," I corrected gently. "He hardly knew me." "He knew I'd chosen someone who shared those values," Mason replied. "Someone who saw wealth as a means, not an end in itself." The moon's reflection rippled across the lake as a night breeze stirred the surface. In the distance, the lights of the main house and surrounding buildings created a warm glow against the darkness, a beacon of the community we'd built, the connections we'd fostered. "I've been thinking about the next decade," Mason said after a comfortable silence. "About evolution and sustainability." "The Foundation's or ours?" I asked. "Both, actually. The twins will be in college before we know it. Lily won't be far behind." He turned to face me more directly. I think it's time we considered succession planning, bringing more voices into leadership positions. We'd discussed this before. The importance of the foundation outgrowing its founders, becoming truly self-sustaining rather than dependent on our direct involvement. Andrea's appointment to the board had been a first step in that direction, but more intentional transitions would be needed. I've been thinking the same thing, I acknowledged, especially as the national programs develop their own identities. They need leadership that reflects their communities. It doesn't mean stepping away entirely, Mason clarified, just creating space for new generations to shape the vision going forward. The conversation continued as we walked back toward the house, discussing potential candidates for increased leadership roles, structural changes that might facilitate broader ownership of the mission, ways to ensure the foundation's financial sustainability beyond our lifetimes. At the edge of the main lawn, we paused, taking in the peaceful scene of the property at night. The historic house and barn illuminated softly, the newer educational buildings with their thoughtful, accessible design, the gardens and workshops and gathering spaces all designed to welcome rather than exclude. Not bad for a barista and an architect, I said softly. Mason's arm tightened around my shoulders. Not bad at all. As we approached the house, we noticed lights still on in the kitchen. Inside, we found Emma and 3 scholarship recipients from the current summer cohort gathered around the large island, deep in conversation while mixing cookie dough. Midnight baking session? I asked, entering the warm, fragrant space. Emma's teaching us her signature chocolate chunk sea salt cookies, explained one of the students, a young woman from the Georgia program. She says they're inspired by your original recipe. With improvements, Emma added with a cheeky grin. No offense, Mom. None taken, I laughed. Innovation is how we grow. The easy camaraderie between our daughter and these scholarship recipients, spanning differences in age, background, and experience, embodied everything we'd hoped to foster through the Foundation's work. Not erasing differences, but celebrating them, creating spaces where diverse perspectives could interact and learn from one another. Mason and I exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging the significance of the moment. This was the true inheritance we were passing on. Not just financial resources or educational opportunities, but a vision of connection across divides, of mutual respect and shared humanity. The next morning, as guests began departing after a farewell brunch, I found myself standing with Margaret on the main house porch, watching the flurry of goodbyes and promises to stay connected. I was thinking about that day you and Richard came to our apartment, I said, when you offered me money to leave Mason. Margaret winced slightly at the memory. Not my finest moment. No, I agreed, but necessary maybe. We all had to start. Somewhere. She turned to me with surprising vulnerability in her eyes. Do you think you've forgiven us? Truly? I considered the question carefully. I think forgiveness isn't a single moment but a process. It's something we've been building together brick by brick over these years. She nodded, seeming to understand. The opposite of rejection isn't just acceptance, I continued. It's active inclusion, making space for genuine belonging. That's what you and Richard have gradually done. Not just tolerating our choices, but embracing the values behind them, contributing to this vision in your own ways. We needed time, Margaret acknowledged. And examples. Seeing the impact of this work, their lives changed. It shifts your perspective. Below us on the lawn, Richard was helping load equipment into a van with several scholarship recipients, showing no concern for his expensive clothes or formerly rigid sense of propriety. Nearby, Mason was deep in conversation with Kevin and Audrey's eldest son Noah about college prospects, while my father entertained Lily and the younger children with elaborate stories. Different kinds of wealth, Margaret said softly, echoing our conversation from the previous evening. I think I finally understand what that means. As the last vehicles departed and the property settled into a temporary calm before the next summer session would begin, our family gathered for a private lunch on the lake deck. 3 generations sat around the table: Richard and Margaret, my parents, Mason and me, our children, Audrey and Kevin, with their diverse brood. Conversation flowed easily across age groups and interests, inside jokes mingling with serious discussions about the foundation's future direction. I thought about that day in the coffee shop, where I'd first noticed Mason sketching in his notebook. How neither of us could have imagined the journey ahead: the rejection and acceptance, the unexpected inheritance, the bridges built between worlds that once seemed destined to remain separate. Uncle Jack's money had provided the opportunity, but it was the choices we'd made about how to use it that had transformed lives, including our own. The true inheritance wasn't measured in dollars, but in connections forged, perspectives broadened, circles of belonging expanded to include those previously excluded. As lunch concluded and the family scattered to enjoy various activities around the property, Mason and I lingered at the table, fingers intertwined, watching the ripples on the lake's surface where Emma and Jackson were teaching Lily to skip stones. "I was right, Mason said quietly. "About what?" "What I told you after that disaster dinner with my parents, when they'd just tried to bribe you to leave me." His eyes met mine, still filled with the same certainty I'd seen that day. "That you were my family now, the family I chose. And now look at us," I replied, gesturing to the expanded circle our choice had created. Not just our children, but the broader community represented by the Foundation's work, the connections that radiated outward like ripples from that initial decision to stand together despite opposition. The inheritance that had once divided us had ultimately become a force for unity, an opportunity to demonstrate that true wealth lies not in exclusivity, but in creating spaces where everyone can thrive. That was Uncle Jack's real gift. Not the money itself, but the chance to build something meaningful that would outlast us all. As the afternoon sun cast golden light across the Vermont landscape, I squeezed Mason's hand, grateful for the journey that had brought us here, from a small wedding with empty chairs to this abundant gathering of chosen family, from rejection to a more inclusive definition of belonging. Some inheritances change bank accounts, others change hearts and minds. The most valuable ones change the future by reshaping what's possible when we choose connection over division, authenticity over appearance, and love over expectation. That was the legacy we hoped to leave, worth far more than any check. 5. Years after our 10th anniversary celebration, I found myself standing in the newly completed Wilson Parker Educational Center in downtown Chicago. The gleaming 6-story building represented the Foundation's most ambitious project to date, a comprehensive urban educational hub that combined early childhood programs, adult education resources, career development services, and community gathering. Spaces under one roof. Mason had designed the building himself, incorporating elements from both the Vermont property and the Wisconsin bakeries. Warm woods, abundant natural light, spaces that encourage interaction while still providing quiet, areas for focused learning. Every detail reflected our evolving philosophy that education should be accessible, engaging, and integrated with real-world application. "Mrs. Wilson?" A young woman approached, tablet in hand. "The reporters are ready for you whenever you're set." Today marked the official opening, with journalists from educational publications, local news outlets, and national media gathered to document what many were calling a revolutionary approach to community education. At 52, I was no longer the nervous barista intimidated by Mason's parents' wealth and status. 2 decades of building the foundation, expanding the bakery enterprise, and raising 3 children had given me a quiet confidence that no amount of money could have purchased. "I'll be right there," I assured her, taking a moment to center myself. The journey to this day has not been without challenges. The expansion to a national model had stretched our resources and energy during those early years. Economic downturns had threatened funding streams. Grant applications had been rejected. Staff had come and gone. There had been moments of disagreement even within our own family about strategic directions and priorities. But through it all, the core vision had remained intact, creating educational opportunities that recognized and nurtured potential regardless of background or circumstance. What had begun with a simple scholarship fund had evolved into a comprehensive educational ecosystem spanning multiple states and serving thousands of individuals annually. As I moved toward the atrium where the press conference would take place, I passed walls lined with photographs documenting the Foundation's history, that first summer in Vermont with 15 nervous scholarship recipients, the groundbreaking for the Georgia campus, Emma at 18 leading her first baking workshop for Foundation participants, Jackson receiving his architectural degree and joining Mason's firm with a focus on community-centered design, Lily at her high school graduation announcing her intention to study early childhood education. There were images of Richard and Margaret throughout the years, initially stiff and formal in their interactions with scholarship recipients, gradually becoming more relaxed, more genuinely engaged. One of my favorites showed Richard in mud-splattered boots helping students plant a community garden at the Wisconsin campus, his expression one of unexpected joy in the physical labor. The most recent photos included our expanding family circle, Emma's partner Sophia, a brilliant economist she'd met during graduate school, Jackson's wife Vanessa and their toddler son Thomas, Audrey and Kevin's growing clan, now including grandchildren, the network of Foundation alumni who had become extended family through their ongoing involvement with our work. The atrium was filled beyond capacity when I arrived, with Foundation staff, board members, major donors, and program participants gathered alongside the media. I spotted Mason in the front row with our children and their partners. Beside them sat my parents, now in their early 80s but still vibrant, still actively involved in the Foundation's work in advisory capacities. Richard, now 83, was seated in a wheelchair, a concession to recent health challenges rather than diminished intellectual engagement. Margaret stood behind him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Audrey and Kevin had made the trip from Vermont, where they now manage the original educational center, while pursuing their own related initiatives. The Foundation's executive director, Andrea Thompson, that same scholarship recipient from our first summer program, now a nationally recognized educational leader, stepped to the podium to begin the proceedings. 20 years ago, she began, I was a community college student working 3 jobs and struggling to see a path forward. Today, I stand before you as living proof of what can happen when potential meets opportunity, when bridges are built across divides of privilege and access. She spoke eloquently about the Foundation's evolution, the thousands of lives transformed through its programs, and the vision for this new urban center as a model for similar initiatives in cities across the country. Then she introduced me to deliver the keynote address. As I approached the podium, I felt the weight of the journey we'd traveled, from rejection to reconciliation, from a single scholarship to a national foundation, from suspicion across class divides to genuine respect and collaboration. Thank you for joining us on this momentous day, I began. The building we dedicate today represents not just physical space, but a philosophy. That education should break down barriers rather than reinforce them. That knowledge and opportunity belong to everyone, and that true community is built through genuine connection across differences. I shared the story of the Foundation's origins, being careful to honor Uncle Jack's vision, while emphasizing that the most valuable aspects of his legacy weren't financial, but philosophical. I spoke about the lessons we'd learned through success and failure, the importance of adapting to community needs rather than imposing predetermined solutions, and the ongoing commitment to creating educational models that recognized diverse forms of intelligence and potential. This center stands on ground once occupied by a factory that closed 30 years ago, leaving economic devastation in its wake, I noted. Today, We reclaim this space not just for education, but for economic revitalization, for community empowerment, for the belief that everyone deserves the chance to define success on their own terms. After the formal presentation, as guests toured the facility and media conducted interviews with program participants, I found myself standing with Richard near the rooftop garden that crowned the building. "I never thought I'd live to see this," he said, his voice weaker than in years past, but his mind still sharp. From a family that valued exclusivity above all else to this. He gestured to the diverse gathering around us, the Chicago skyline beyond. "You've been an important part of it," I reminded him, "especially the medical scholarship programs." He nodded, acknowledging this contribution but seeming preoccupied with deeper thoughts. "I was so wrong about you, Ellie, about what Mason needed, about what constituted a worthwhile life." Even after all these years, his direct acknowledgments of past mistakes were rare enough to catch me by surprise. "We've all evolved in our thinking," I offered. "That's part of living consciously." "Not everyone does," he countered. "Many people my age become more rigid in their views, not less. I might have been one of them, if circumstances hadn't forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about value and worth. I thought about the complex journey we'd traveled together, the initial rejection, the tentative reconnection after the inheritance, the gradual building of mutual respect that had eventually blossomed into genuine appreciation and even love. It hadn't been a straight path. There had been setbacks, misunderstandings, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But the overall trajectory had been toward greater understanding, toward the dismantling of artificial barriers. "I'm proud of you," I told him, the words coming easily now, though they would have been impossible to imagine speaking in those early years. "Your willingness to change, to reconsider deeply held beliefs, that's a rare quality at any age." His eyes, faded with time but still alert, met mine. "I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what I'm leaving behind." "The medical scholarship program bears your name," I reminded him. "Your contributions to the Foundation's healthcare initiatives have been substantial." "I don't mean material legacies," he clarified. "I mean the impact of how we live, the traces we leave in others' lives." From our vantage point, we could see into several of the center's classrooms and community spaces, where guests were interacting with displays highlighting various Foundation programs. In one room, Emma was demonstrating bread-making techniques as part of the culinary training program she'd developed. In another, Jackson was explaining architectural features that made the building exceptionally energy efficient. Lily was leading a tour of the early childhood spaces, her passion for developmental psychology evident in her animated explanations. "Look at them," Richard said softly. "Your children, the values they embody, the work they're doing in the world. That's a legacy beyond price." The moment was interrupted by Margaret joining us, concerned about Richard becoming overtired. As she prepared to take him back to their hotel for a rest before the evening's gala dinner, he reached for my hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your patience, for giving us the chance to become better versions of ourselves." After they departed, Mason found me still on the rooftop, looking out over the city as afternoon light bathed the skyline in golden hues. "Successful launch?" he asked, slipping his arm around my waist in a gesture that still felt as natural as breathing after 25 years of marriage. "Beyond expectations," I confirmed. "Andrea says the mayor is already talking about replicating the model in 3 other neighborhoods." "I just had an interesting conversation with that reporter from the Education Journal," Mason said. "She asked what we consider our greatest accomplishment after 20 years of this work." "What did you tell her?" "That it's not a program or a building or even the number of people we've helped," he replied. "It's the shift in perspective, both, our own and others, about what constitutes value, what represents meaningful success." I nodded, understanding completely. Richard just said something similar. about legacy being more than material contributions. He's grown philosophical in his older age, Mason observed with gentle humor, a far cry from the rigid surgeon who refused to attend our wedding. People contain multitudes, I said, capacity for both tremendous growth and stubborn resistance. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the bustling city below, thinking about the complex journey that had brought us to this moment. Neither of us were the same people who had exchanged vows in my parents' backyard all those years ago. Him with his architectural dreams still taking shape, me with my modest bakery ambitions. We had been transformed by parenthood, by the responsibility of managing significant resources, by the complex work of building institutions that embodied our values. Yet the core of who we were remained intact. The qualities that had drawn us together initially had deepened rather than diminished through the challenges we'd faced together. My practical approach to problem-solving balanced his visionary thinking. His strategic mind complemented my intuitive understanding of people's needs. Together, we had built something neither could have created alone. The evening's gala dinner was held in the center's community hall, transformed for the occasion with elegant lighting and table settings that somehow managed to feel both festive and accessible, like the foundation itself. Scholarship recipients past and present mingled with donors, educators, civic leaders, and family members in a vibrant celebration of collective achievement. During dinner, a short film was shown documenting the Foundation's 20-year journey. Watching the progression from those first modest scholarship awards to the comprehensive educational ecosystem we'd built, I felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in what we'd accomplished, gratitude for the support that had made it possible, humility about the work still to be done. The film included interviews with program participants whose lives had been changed through the Foundation's work, the single mother who'd become a nurse practitioner and now served on our healthcare advisory board, the former factory worker who'd retrained as a sustainable building specialist and helped design our Oregon campus, the first-generation college student who'd founded a tech company that now employed other Foundation alumni. Their stories represented the true measure of our work, not buildings or programs or financial metrics, but human potential recognized, nurtured, and empowered to create further positive change. After the film, Andrea introduced a surprise segment, a series of recorded messages from people who had been part of the Foundation's journey but couldn't attend in person. Former staff members shared memories of early challenges overcome. Educational partners spoke about collaborative initiatives that had expanded possibilities for their communities. Family friends reflected on watching the organization evolve, from a simple idea to a national model. The final message came from an unexpected source, Uncle Jack himself. Andrea explained that while going through archival materials for the anniversary, they had discovered a video recording Jack had made shortly before his death, to be viewed by Mason after the transfer of the inheritance. We debated whether to include this, Andrea said, but decided its message resonates with today's celebration in powerful ways. The screen filled with Jack's face, a man in his 70s with Mason's eyes and a weathered complexion that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His expression was serious but kind as he looked directly into the camera. "Mason," he began, "if you're watching this, then I'm gone and you've received my estate. I've thought carefully about this decision, about bypassing the conventional Wilson inheritance patterns to leave everything to you directly." He paused, adjusting his position slightly. "I've watched from a distance as you've forged your own path, choosing meaningful work over status, authentic connections over social advantage. That choice resonates with me. It's the same one I made, decades ago, though under different circumstances." Jack spoke briefly about his own journey, leaving behind the expectations of the Wilson medical dynasty to pursue photography, exploring remote landscapes and indigenous communities, gradually building both a career and an investment portfolio that reflected his values rather than family traditions. "Money is neutral," he continued. It's neither good nor evil inherently. What matters is how we use it, whether to reinforce existing power structures or to challenge them, whether to build walls or bridges, whether to amplify or diminish human potential. His expression grew more intense, more focused. I'm leaving. You these resources not because you're my nephew by blood, but because I believe you'll use them wisely, creatively, perhaps even subversively. The greatest rebellion against a system that values exclusivity is to create radical inclusion. The most powerful response to inherited privilege is to transform it into broader opportunity. He smiled then, a wry expression that highlighted his resemblance to Mason. I have no specific instructions for how you should use this inheritance. That's your journey to determine. But I hope you'll consider it an opportunity to reimagine what's possible, to build something meaningful that reflects your own values rather than simply perpetuating established patterns. The message concluded with Jack looking directly into the camera, his gaze seeming to transcend time and space to connect with those of us watching in that moment. Remember that the most valuable inheritances aren't financial at all, but the courage to live authentically, to question assumptions, and to create communities of belonging rather than exclusion. That's the true Wilson legacy I hope you'll carry forward. As the screen faded to black, a palpable emotion filled the room. The message, though recorded for Mason alone 15 years earlier, seemed to articulate perfectly the philosophy that had guided the Foundation's evolution, not just expanding educational opportunities, but fundamentally rethinking how opportunity itself was distributed and defined. Mason, seated beside me, wiped moisture from his eyes. I never saw this, he said quietly. Barbara gave me his letter, but I never knew there was a video. He would be proud, I whispered, squeezing his hand. So proud of what you've built with his gift. What we've built, Mason corrected. All of us together. Later that night, after the celebration had concluded and guests had departed, our family gathered in the center's rooftop garden for a more intimate moment of reflection. 3 generations sat in a circle, Mason and I, our children with their partners, my parents, Richard and Margaret, Audrey and Kevin with their eldest son Noah, who now worked for the Foundation's outreach program. Emma raised her glass in the moonlight. To Uncle Jack, she said, for setting everything in motion. To your parents, my father added, nodding toward Mason and me, for having the vision to create something extraordinary from that initial gift. To all of us, Richard said, his voice stronger than it had been earlier, for learning to see beyond our limitations, to recognize value in unexpected places. As the quiet conversation continued, I found myself reflecting on the complex journey we'd traveled, from that first meeting in a coffee shop to this moment on a rooftop in Chicago, surrounded by family that had been forged through both blood and choice. The path had not been straight or easy. There had been conflicts and misunderstandings, moments of doubt and exhaustion, challenges that tested our commitment to the vision we were building. Yet through it all, something remarkable had emerged. Not just the Foundation itself with its buildings and programs, but a new understanding of what constituted wealth, success, family, and belonging. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had gradually eroded, replaced by bridges of mutual respect and shared purpose. As the conversation shifted to plans for the Foundation's future, programs Emma hoped to develop, communities Jackson wanted to serve through his architectural work, educational models Lily was researching for the early childhood centers. I watched Richard listening intently, offering occasional insights from his decades of experience while remaining open to new approaches he would never have considered in his younger years. The true miracle wasn't just in what we had built together, but in how we had been transformed through the building, each of us becoming more expansive versions of ourselves by encountering perspectives we might otherwise never have understood. Uncle Jack's inheritance had provided the catalyst, but the real work had been done through thousands of daily choices, to listen rather than judge, to collaborate rather than control, to recognize value beyond conventional measures of success. That was the legacy being passed to the next generation now, an inheritance far more valuable than any financial bequest. As the evening wound down and family members began to depart for their hotels, Mason and I lingered in the rooftop garden, looking out over the city lights that mirrored the stars above. "Would you have believed this possible?" Mason asked, gesturing to the building below us, the thriving foundation it represented. "That day in the coffee shop, when I first asked about, 'You're baking?' I smiled, thinking of that shy barista with dreams of owning her own small bakery someday. Not in the details, no, but the essence of it. The desire to create something meaningful, to build connections rather than walls, that was there from the beginning." "It was," Mason agreed. "In both of us. Uncle Jack just gave us the means to express it on a larger scale." We stood together in comfortable silence, our hands intertwined as they had been countless times over the years, through celebrations and challenges, through the raising of children and the building of institutions, through the complex work of reconciliation across differences that had once seemed unbridgeable. The empty chairs at our wedding had long since been filled, not just with Mason's immediate family, but with an expanding circle of connection that transcended conventional boundaries of kinship. What had begun as rejection had catalyzed the creation of something far more inclusive, more generative, more aligned with our deepest values than simple acceptance ever could have been. Uncle Jack's inheritance had changed everything, yet it had changed nothing essential, merely providing the resources to express more fully who we already were, what we already valued, what we already believed possible. The true wealth lay not in the numbers on a bank statement, but in the connections forged, the perspectives broadened, the communities strengthened through our work together. As we turned to leave, the Chicago skyline glittering before us and the educational center humming with possibility below, I thought about the countless individuals whose lives had intersected with ours through the Foundation's work, each with their own gifts to offer, their own contributions to make, their own unique value that transcended conventional measures of worth. That was the real inheritance we were passing forward, not financial resources alone, but a fundamental reimagining of what constituted wealth, success, family, and belonging. A legacy measured not in dollars but in lives transformed, barriers dismantled, and possibilities expanded. A legacy worth far more than any check could ever provide. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.